In Essential Task 4.1, we are going to define intelligence and describe relevant labels related to intelligence testing, while at the same time talking about some of the various changes that have occurred in our understanding of intelligence over time. I recommend a horizontal concept map. It is the 6 boxes that you see here left to right, 1 under nature or nurture, 2 under change over time, and then 3 under labeling. I'll return back to the text of the task to allow you to pause the video and copy down the yellow portion. But as I alluded to, we are going to begin all the way to the left under nature or nurture. This is the first time that we've seen this question in this course. This question is one that we are going to address throughout the year. It is a classic question that applies not only to behavioral science, but also to a variety of sciences, which is the question, are we a byproduct of our genes, things that we inherit, or are we a byproduct of the environment that we live in? Our culture, our parents, the parenting style of our parents, etc. Well, research shows that genetics plays a large part in our individual intelligence, and we can use identical twins and fraternal twins as a means of measuring this question. So I'm going to take a look here at this graph with you. This is the very first time that we're going to reference twin studies. Twin studies are so valuable because it provides us a rather unique circumstance to evaluate the effects of genetics and to evaluate the effects of the environment, really to address that nature versus nurture question head on. Identical twins have the exact same genetics as one another. Fraternal twins have incredibly similar genetics to one another. There's then also just 2 regular siblings and then people who are unrelated. So if we were to rank these groups in terms of genetic similarity, we would have identical, fraternal, siblings, and then non-related. If you take a look here at these bar graphs, you'll notice that there are varying degrees of similarity between intelligence scores, which is the y-axis, depending on which group we're looking at. Identical twins who are reared together have a 0.85 correlation between their IQ scores, between their intelligence scores. Now remember, the closer you are to either positive 1 or negative 1, the stronger the correlation. 0.85 is an extremely strong positive correlation. So identical twins who live together, generally speaking, have pretty strong similarities in their IQ scores. They're positively correlated. As one IQ test goes up, their other IQ test is going to go up. The bar to the right, though, is actually quite fascinating. Identical twins reared apart. Reared apart means, and this does actually happen, 2 identical twins who are actually separated at birth, resulting in living in 2 totally different environments. This could be 2 totally different countries, usually means 2 totally different states. It essentially means 2 identical twins who never meet each other and don't have really any interaction with one another. What's fascinating here is the correlation for IQ scores under that condition is only a little bit over 0.7, let's say 0.72. So now we have 2 differing scenarios, identical twins who grow up together and identical twins who live apart. And what's really fascinating is that their correlations are not the same. This gives us the belief that in addition to genetics, environment must play some type of role in your IQ, meaning the school that you go to, your parents, the parenting style. It could be adoptive parents in the circumstance of being split at birth. There has to be something that explains the difference between these 2 bars to the left. And the only difference is environment, because again, all identical twins have the same genetics as one another. So when we look at these 2 bars, genetics would be the same regardless of if they were reared together or reared apart. So the only way of explaining this about 10 to 15% difference in the correlation is environment. What's really fascinating here, though, is if you take a look at the 3rd bar down, fraternal twins who actually grow up together, meaning they go to the same school, they have the same parents, same parenting styles, all of that, their correlation is only 0.6. This is incredible because this gives us evidence to suggest that in addition to the environment, genetics plays a massive, massive role. Because look, if 2 individuals are identical twins but never, ever meet each other, they are more likely going to share similar IQ scores than 2 fraternal twins who, again, do not have exactly the same genetics, even if those 2 individuals were grown up together, were born into the same house, had the same parents, went to the same school. So when we look at this twin study, there are really 2 big conclusions. The fact that identical twins, regardless of if they are raised together or not, are the two highest values correlation-wise is evidence that genetics plays a role in our IQ. However, the fact that there is a difference between identical twins who are reared together versus identical twins who are reared apart also gives us some evidence to suggest that the environment, the teacher, the teaching style that you experience, the parents and the parenting styles, your culture, etc., also play a role in your IQ. So with the question, is it nature? Meaning, is it our genetics that explains our intelligence? Well, partially, yes. It plays a huge role. Is it nurture? The parenting style, the teachers that we've had? Well, also yes. Both of these play a role in our understanding of intelligence. Continuing onward, there are two studies that have looked at intelligence and evaluated how the concept of intelligence has changed over time. The first is a gentleman by the name of Lewis Thurman. Thurman's going to get a small contributing psychologist, letter C. Thurman conducted his study originally in 1921. Often this is called Thurman's longitudinal study. And the way it worked is this. Every approximately 5 to 10 years, Thurman followed up with his participants, starting at a very young age, and followed them throughout their life, and essentially wanted to track whether or not children who were identified as gifted at the very beginning, meaning high IQ, ended up growing up to live normal, healthy lives. At the time in the 1920s, there was a bit of a misconception that just because somebody had a really high IQ, that somehow would negatively impact them socially. That might make them less likely to be married, less likely to maintain a job, less likely to have friends, etc. Well, the opposite was true. Even though students had high IQs, gifted would indicate over 135 IQ. Even though these children had high IQs, that didn't necessarily doom them to social ineptness. As a matter of fact, the entire contrary was found. These children grew up to be normal functioning adults, normal lives, just like just about everybody else. So there's really no unique negative impact from having a really high IQ identified as a child back when this study began in 1921. And what's really fascinating about the study is Thurman's colleagues followed up even after Thurman himself died. So this study began in 1921, but these individuals were followed up upon by his colleagues and future researchers so that we could continue the study really until the participants themselves began to die off. Another bit of research, somewhat recent, is what's called the Flynn effect. You do not have to watch the video in the top right corner. It's a whole TED Talk, but if you're curious about this, by all means, there's a TED Talk in the top right corner that you can watch. The Flynn effect is this interesting phenomenon where if we use standards from decades ago to evaluate intelligence today, it would indicate that intelligence is off the charts, and that's simply untrue. We need to understand that standardized tests themselves, things like IQ tests, SATs, etc., actually need to be constantly updated because intelligence as a whole, broadly, has been steadily improving. And if you were to take an IQ test from 100 years ago today, you would likely score in the top 5%, maybe even higher. You would likely score in the gifted range. And I'm not saying that you wouldn't score in the gifted range if you took an IQ test today, but to score in the gifted range is really the top 2% of people, which, again, you very easily could score up there, but it's just unlikely. However, using old tests, you likely would reach the standards, at least the standards that applied in 1920 or 1930. And as a result of this steady increase in IQ scores, we've actually had to make IQ tests more and more challenging over the years. We've had to constantly revamp IQ tests in order to increase their difficulty to ensure that the standards apply. Meaning, IQ tests typically have an average score of 100. And they are evaluated and they are created to produce a 100 IQ score, meaning average. If all of a sudden the average creeps up to 125 because average IQ has just steadily been increasing, well, that would be a problem. That IQ test would no longer really produce the results that it intends to produce, especially if that test indicates that a score of 135 equals gifted. So as a result of that, IQ tests themselves have actually been progressively made more difficult in order to correctly adjust for this. As a mnemonic, when I look at his name, I see the F-L-Y in Flynn, and I think of the word flying. His name kind of looks like flying. If you think about Flynn and flying, that's a good connection here because if you connect it to IQ scores, that's precisely what's been happening. IQ scores have steadily gone up relative to old standards, And as a result of that, we need to make current modern-day IQ tests more difficult than the tests 100 years ago. Now that we've addressed some of the changes over time in terms of IQ, one, dispelling the notion that gifted somehow means social ineptness. That's not true. And two, acknowledging that the average IQ, the average demonstration of intelligence has changed over time. And as a result, we've had to make IQ tests more challenging. There are some labels to look at when talking about actual IQ scores. You don't need to copy down this visual up here, this what we call distribution graph, this normal distribution graph. We'll talk more about that later. We will start though at the bottom left corner and talking about what can sometimes be called cognitive disability. I make it a vocab word as intellectual disability, but they are synonyms of one another. The reason we're talking about intellectual disabilities is that there is an IQ score attached with this. When we're talking about intellectual disabilities, we're talking about an individual who has an IQ of 70 or below, which would be in the bottom 2% over here. In addition to just the low IQ, there also is some type of clear difficulty with everyday normal life demands. That can be hygiene, that can be occupational, educational. So in addition to simply the label of intellectual disability and that IQ score, there's another element involved. Progressing onward is a phenomenon known as savant syndrome. What's interesting here is I've attached this here in green with my arrows because savant syndrome really is closely entwined with this lower IQ score. Individuals with savant syndrome might typically score low, score poorly on your standard IQ test, to a point where an individual with savant syndrome might very well score 70 or below in the range of an intellectual disability. However, with that aside, these individuals still have unbelievably profound abilities, oftentimes in very unique skills. So that can be things like memory, things like art, things like music, and I mean beyond just your typical abilities. I mean the ability to look at the skyline of New York for a half hour and recreate it perfectly. I mean being able to memorize every date, every leader's birthday, the day of the week that they were born. I am talking about absolutely unbelievable skills. I am requiring you to watch this video here to the left. It is really an exceptional case of savant syndrome. Kim Peek, the individual pictured on the right, is shown in this video, and what's unbelievable is that Kim would very likely have scored poorly on your typical IQ tests. Very easily could have scored intellectual disability 70 or below, but his memory is unbelievable. If you're familiar with the movie Rain Man, he is the individual portrayed in that movie. And if you haven't seen that movie, it's okay. But if you have some familiarity with that movie, this is where it comes from. As a mnemonic, when I look at savant, I see the SAV and I think the word savvy. Savvy by definition means understands. Kim Peek has an unbelievable understanding of calendars and birthdays, as you will see, beyond anything that you would even think was humanly possible, to a point where he can open up a book, scan the book for about 10 seconds, and flip to the next page because he's memorized the entirety of it. According to some, he used to be able to read one page with one eye, one page with another eye. I mean, these are unbelievable skills. The final thing, though, that will conclude this essential task is talking about the other end of the spectrum. So instead of that bottom 2% in that 70 or below range of scoring, we're actually going to go to the top 2%, a little bit above the top 2%, which is gifted. Gifted would indicate a score of 135 or above. So again, these are the children that were studied in Thurman's longitudinal study. In addition, though, to just simply a IQ score of 135, we also need to look for some type of indication that that IQ is translating into other areas, whether that's creativity, commitment, or motivation, meaning a high IQ score without the desire to apply that, often academically, but it doesn't have to be academically, might not actually qualify for gifted. In a modern context, we're looking for not only that IQ score, but an indication that that IQ score might be leading this individual towards striving for high achievement, towards simply just being an academic, whatever it might happen to be.